Hello. I'm a little bit early, about 4 minutes early, because I thought I might as well. Hi. I'm Chris from Airwindows, for the two of you that are there, and here is my question and answer stream, which I've also announced over on Colin Benders' Discord. So in case anybody shows up from there, hi there. And I have a topic today of sorts, which might be good. I'm also going to fool around with like my settings and things a little to make sure this is all right. I seem to have audio, I seem to have video. I'm wearing a cool new shirt. Yay. I'm going to bury my image behind the edge of this light ring. And yeah, I think we are ready to roll. Shane, hey. I'm glad you're enjoying them. Been doing that for some time, and going full Patreon was the funnest thing probably I've ever done, because it enabled me to give stuff in a more extensive way. It's like kind of like Colin Benders went full remix and started putting out stems of everything, which I don't personally do, but I went full open source, so my music is not interesting enough to people, at least so far. We'll see. Prove it to me if that's true. But it's not interesting enough to people for me to be doing like stems and all that kind of stuff. Plus, that's not very easy to do. But my audio DSP code has been interesting enough that the open source has been pretty well received. So Shane's starting us right off with a question. I might not even get over to my music Ketchup theme that I was going to bring. We might have time for that though. I'm going to go until like 12:41, which is an hour and 41 minutes. That's tied to the amount of Patreon I get, so it's not the same every week, but it's always a fixed number, and I'll do that much or better. So the thing about being a C# programmer is probably plugins you're doing, if they're backward compatible with stuff, are likely to be essentially C. Like both the Apple Audio Unit and Steinberg VST frameworks are not actually C in nature, because they're variations on C++, or I'm not really sure, it might be Objective-C or something. Probably not. But the bits that you code in the DSP section are very much going to be regular C rather than any fancy object-oriented stuff, because things are happening too fast in the buffer loop of a plugin, and you got to do 44,000 operations per second without screwing up a single one in order to get the audio out. So there's not a lot of time for like defining classes and such. So in audio DSP coding, you're likely to be sticking to basic C stuff, and this is good. So as far as creating your first simple plugin, you're going to need to get a hold of some kind of framework and compiler. If you're a C# programmer, presume that might mean that you are Windows based, which is probably more often, it's more common, although not necessarily in musician circles. So you might want to be looking into the VST stuff. There's complications in VST, which are not actually all that great, I think, but the complications in VST are that a lot of people are going to want to do VST2, like say VST 2.4. Steinberg is not making it legal for you to do that. They're trying to push everybody onto VST3 by force, which is not as reliable, at least so I've heard, and not as backward compatible, a bunch of various things like that, which I tend to resist as a coder. So that's a problem. I suppose it's possible you can get a hold of the VST 2.4 SDK and just be making stuff, because if you're making them for your own use or whatever, I'm not sure they can do anything to hurt you. But those are limitations there. As far as creating your first simple plugin, I think a lot of people will do what I tend to do, which is treat stuff as a template. You're not making up everything from scratch. What you're doing is ideally starting from something. I'll get to that, Diego. You're starting from something like one of the templates that I put up in the Airwindows GitHub. You'll be able to find like the closest I could get to what I start with. And it'll be a plugin that does all of its various things, hopefully establishes some controls and things that you can manipulate. And it's probably like a gain plugin. So that would be your first simple plugin. You start with that, and you're not necessarily doing the tricky stuff of like, how do I call into the system or whatever. You're working within the little tiny box, which is, this is what I do in the audio section. And you're thinking primarily of like, the purpose of this exercise is to make stuff sound different, or to make it sound in some kind of way. That becomes the challenge. Dealing with connecting to the DAW and stuff, I feel shouldn't necessarily be your problem. So you're going to want to be thinking more in terms of what interesting things can I do with samples. Now I'm going to go over to Diego for a moment. Shane, you can come back with questions like if you're not clear on what samples are or how they work or how you would manipulate blocks of things. I can talk you through that as well, and you can get a start on there. So, Diego, as far as, and hello in Vermont, USA, what would be the right channels in aux and master to emulate an analog console right? That's a really broad question. That is not something that I can directly answer. So the thing about that is I made a download called Airwindows Starter Kit, and there's a video that goes along with it. And the thing with that starter kit is it is emulating a specific analog console, but it's a fairly sort of flavorless, it's high vibe but low fancy color console. Namely, I'm trying to do my Heritage Audio MCM 20.4, which is sort of an old school. It's like so old school that it doesn't have sliders, it has knobs. And it's designed to basically be very minimal amounts of simple gain and pan into a stereo bus with some things like AUXes. So as far as emulating the analog console, the starter kit and the video that talks through a lot of this stuff and takes about an hour to watch is talking you through the basics of how to get the console system up and working, and some of the things about coloring and softening the sound in the ways that the starter kit enables. Now I have hundreds of plugins, so there's many other ways you can make color on a sound. In fact, there's a plugin called Bus Colors, but there's no specific channels, aux, and master plugin chain or setting. It's just start with your basics and then start trying to identify what kind of colors you're trying to get. Like if you're trying to analog a specific brand name of analog console, you need to know what that means to you. Like it can't be just a label. It's got to be like, oh, I want the thick plush bass of Neve consoles and I'm okay with the slightly rolled off quality, or I want that zing of an SSL and that funny punchiness that is actually not as smooth and lush as things like API and Neve and so on. You need to break stuff down to the building blocks in order to work sensibly with it, because the stuff that I make is never or almost never brand name tied. It's more along the lines of how do you do basic operations. So I'll leave you with that one, although you can come back with it. And Stephen K. is asking on the Purist Fade webpage, are the min-max values that, well, that depends. What do you mean scalable? Are the values adjustable to a limited range or not? Well, what do you mean values? What do you mean values and what do you mean scalable? Because what I changed was like ballistics. It's the way it moves, and that is not the same for the entire throw of the slider. And this is a fine time to explain what Purist Fade is, although I did that in the video, but I can talk further about it and answer questions because that's the most appropriate way I can spend this Monday Q&A session. So basically the problem with Purist Gain for mastering engineer fades is that the ballistics of it, the way that it was responding to motions, was smoothing the motion of the knob, and both of those controls do that because it's sort of the gain thing. It's fairly fundamental to the behavior of that for something that you're going to actively be using. But the difference in volume, like the difference in volume on the top slider, which is minus 40 to plus 40, which is a pretty wide range, granted, is the same obvious difference no matter where on the slider it is, because it's a linear motion measured in dB, which is a logarithmic experience. So it's being scaled. So smoothing the motion of the slider is going to be the same throughout. However, the 0 to 1 slider is 1 is full volume and 0 is silence. Differences between like 0.999 and 1 is a tiny fraction of a dB. Differences between 0.00001 and 0 is actually an enormous quantity of dB. It's just in the quiet fade area of things. And that was where the problem arose as far as mastering engineers trying to fade with it, is it would smooth to a certain point, and then when they tried to go from very, very quiet to silent, sudden change in loudness. So what's happened is I've scaled the speed. First of all, I set up the speed to already be slower than what Purist Gain does. And then I also scaled the speed to sample rate, which is not intrinsic to Purist Gain or the top fader, but it's the idea is managing zipper noise rather than making any particular speed of motion. And the bottom fader of Purist Fade is very much about making a predictable speed of motion. So it's already going to be adjusted to the sample rate, and it's already going to be slower. And then it is also, and Shane might be interested in this detail as far as like making first plugins and stuff. What's happening is I'm multiplying the amount. The amount has to be larger to be slower, because what it's doing is it is doing a what you might call a lerp function. It's a interpolation, linear interpolation. And the way it's doing that, and I might as well get my paper and pen out so that I can illustrate that, is one of these days I'm going to bring up Windows and be typing stuff into compilers and such. Perhaps not this one. I'm going to draw a simple interpolation thing. Here you go. Basic math. Oh, except for I better make this a more obvious X. Look like a Y. So if you do this thing, like X times 999 plus Y divided by 1000, If you do that, you're going to wind up with basically the result of x again, almost. What you're doing is you're adding a thousandth of a y and then scaling down x by exactly the amount that you need, so that if like x was 1 and then you added a million thousandths of y, it would start creeping upwards. But if x is always like 0.999 and then you add a thousandth of y, then it will gradually converge in y. But it'll take a long time to do it. And what's happening is I'm defining this number, and this number is one more than the previous one here. And that's starting off as a big number, but I'm also dividing it by that control, the lower control, the one that goes from 0 to 1. Now you can't divide things by 0, so I have to add a tiny amount to it. I think either I'm adding a tiny amount to it, or I am just asking, like, is this 0? If it's 0, then it's 0.000001. Or if it's less than this, then it is equal to this, because you can't divide by 0. And that also gives me the maximum slowness of the behavior, because when you have like a 1, and you got your number that slows things down so that it only moves so fast, and you divide that by 1, it's the same thing. But if your number is 0.001, it's like right next to silence, then what that does is you're dividing your number that if it's larger, it slows down the reaction time of the thing. You're dividing that by a tiny fraction, which is the same as multiplying it by a big number. They're sort of, you can do opposite ranges of these things. And that means the number that you're smoothing stuff with becomes enormous, and that means it responds very slowly. So what I get out of that is Purist Fade's lower slider can respond fairly quickly if it is up in near 1 or halfway or whatever. But then as you start getting down to almost silence or 0, if you set it to 0, like click it on 0, it instantly goes to that smallest number that I have enabled. And that's also why some of the behaviors are the way that they are. Because it's like the slowness of it is that smallest number as a maximum slowness. But if you click it on 0, it goes to that maximum slowness immediately. And that's why it does that. If you slide it much slower than... Yeah, but in this case, Joku Seko, I'm terrible with names, so you may be Joku Sekovan, or you may Jo Kusek Ovan. I'm completely not sure. In any case, I'm dividing by 0.001, so it's complicated that way. And in doing that, it means that if you're dragging it very slowly, then it's maybe not going to be as smooth up near the top of the 0 to 1 ratio. But the thing about it is those are, subtler divisions anyhow, so you can't really hear minor bobbles. And then as it starts getting down to the small numbers, it'll smooth it quite a lot. And then if you're dragging it fast, what's happening is you're still sort of in the middle of the range rather than at the minimum setting. So you can drag the volume down faster than the automatic factor. Anyhow, that's the best I can do on that. We can get back into it later, but I feel like I'm starting to talk in circles there. And Gamma has a question as well. So, all the coffee, and I haven't even brought up my topic for discussion yet, but I can. High quality headphone solution. Would I buy DAC amplifier, etc.? You know, one thing I have found very effective, if you're looking for if you're talking about buying a dedicated DAC and headphone amp and stuff, I would just straight up get a Lavery Black. I have been using mine for ages, and it is a gorgeous system. It is a really good DAC. It's very high quality, but not euphonic in the sense of it's going to give you what is there. And it has a built-in headphone output that is a very powerful thing. You could probably break headphones with it, so don't crank yourself too much using that. But the headphone in the Lavery DA10 is, I think, a pretty spectacular headphone amplifier. It's got a lot of power, it's dead silent, it's just generally good. So if I was going for highest possible quality headphone solution, that's what I'm personally using. I'm using it where, like when I'm doing these videos and I have headphones in and stuff, those are little Grados. And the, sure. And I am in fact using the Lavery for that. So that is if you're looking for if you're trying to get the highest quality DAC and headphone amp and stuff like that, and you're talking about spending money on a DAC and then also getting a headphone amp, and maybe looking into audiophile type stuff and whatever. If you're going to do that, I would recommend going with just the Lavery and using that for the headphone amp, because I feel it is really solid, and it's expensive, but so would be getting that as component stuff. And I feel that it is more likely, like if you're doing critical music work or an analytical work, you're better off with that than with like, this is the DAC and the headphone amp that gives the most gorgeous lush sound, because in audiophilia you can get stuff that intentionally sounds golden and buttery and lush and goodness what other kinds of things people can. My point being, it's not necessarily just like hacky salesmanship and stuff. People are capable of making circuits actually sound in these ways, but you don't necessarily want that for critical work. For critical work, you're going to want something that is clean but also very high quality, and that's what I use the Lavery for. Vinyl has a quick question: can plugins use multiple cores, and what algo would even need that? You know, I don't think my plugins are using multiple cores. In theory, you could assign separate plugins to different cores, and what algorithm would need that? For perhaps something like a convolution reverb. You could easily do like a multi-threaded convolution reverb, because different areas would be keeping track of different sort of subsets of the overall convolution and multiplying back and reporting back on their results. So that said, I'm not sure if plugins do use multiple cores. It's a little bit over my head. I am not really down with figuring that stuff out. Even when I get into fancy areas, like I've been spending a lot of time today thinking about how to make a video game involving sort of like little tanks communicating electricity with laser turrets. But I also saw an Animal Crossing stream and went, wow, their worlds are cylinders. I never knew that. And what if I have the little video game where the tanks have to connect with each other? And I thought that I was going to be obscuring their view with just terrain, mountains and stuff. But then they were on a little globe. But the globe could be like the Animal Crossing cylinder, where you can see it, but that doesn't necessarily have to be how the game engine understands it. And so I try to keep track of these things where possible. but it does lead me far afield sometimes. And Bo, the topic for today is music catch-up, but I may not get the chance to talk about that. Depends upon how many other questions people have. And what Rickenbacker model do I have? That's like a 4000. It's not a 4001. It's not vintage. It's not even in particularly good condition, and it's not stock, because it was a 4000 and somebody added the bass pickup to it. So it's not really meant to be like that, but I do like the fact that the unbound neck is kind of like Chris Squire's Rickenbacker. And I've got it wired up in stereo, and that's that rock song that I did. I haven't done anything since, but I don't naturally gravitate towards Z rock and roll-y music. That is running a stereo output. So it's like Rico sound, but it wasn't designed to have it, and so I just sort of hacked it into shape. I haven't done any like luthiery work on it, but I did mess with the wiring a little bit because that's something I'm comfortable doing. And it is neat. It has like the big chunky area near the headstock where you're playing in root position and all of a sudden it's like, your hand doesn't fit around the neck anymore. And I guess I can get used to that, probably is contributing to the sound. Oh yeah, thank you about the t-shirt. This is a new t-shirt of mine. It is a Yes Fragile shirt. And that is because I got in fact, you can see it behind me. There's a little stack of, actually maybe you can't see it anywhere near as well as I thought. Just a moment. Oh, yes, you can. See that? It is a stack of prog rock albums. There's Yes albums, and there's the King Crimson 1980s stuff. And that is because there's this store, it's a Burning Shed in the UK. I stumbled across them and they had all of that cool stuff, and I was like, wow, I'm bookmarking this for later. And then when, coronavirus and stuff happened, I was like, oh shit, what if they run into trouble? What if they're not going to be there? Let's just buy all of the things from there now. And I saw that they had shirts, and I was like, Fragile shirt? Perfect. And so I have a Fragile shirt, and very well pleased with that. I might be wearing it on streams as well. Might need to get a whole range of shirts for classic Yes albums. Am I aware that LVC Audio uses floating point dither based in mine, and they gave me credit on their site? Cool. That's what it's there for. And the only real restriction of the MIT license is that you give credit as long as it isn't your own, like, not Voxing, Isotope could be using a form of floating point dither that they don't have to give any credit for, because a guy from Isotope kind of helped me develop the final details of it. I had it working, and this guy was like, this is a legitimate concept, but I'm measuring it in this fancy measuring apparatus, and it is not fully dithering. And other people were like, what are you talking about? It's crazy in the first place. And no, it's a good concept, but it's not fully dithering. It needs to be like this. And so he came up with a little variation in the code that did fully dither. And then I dug in and I found a third way of doing it, which wasn't his way of doing the code, and nailed down what I figure is the exact amount of dither that you require to do this stuff, and used that. So now there are two different people who have fully functioning floating point dither, me and the fellow from Isotope. And they may never need to use it, but if they did, they wouldn't have to give me any credit, because the fellow who did it reversed engineered his own way of doing it. Have I done any MIDI FX VST projects? No, I have not. If I ran across some really cool example code, like somebody who had a VST 2.4 ideally that did that and had like open source code available, that might open things up for me being able to fool with it. Because with a lot of these things, like, I have autism, so I can dig into some of these things very deeply, and sometimes I'll lose days thinking about this kind of stuff. But by the same token, I have autism, so I don't necessarily get new concepts unless I see them. It's like either I get them or I don't get them at all. it was very difficult going through school for this reason, because it was exactly the same thing. It's like either I got it to the point where it's like, oh, I completely understand everything about this now, and then I don't have to think about it again, or I was just completely stuck and it didn't matter how long I beat my head against it, I wasn't getting anywhere. And MIDI VSTs would be like that. Same as MIDI audio units, which I believe can also be a thing, but I don't know how to do them. And it's the sort of thing where I need to see working source and go from that. I'm running into a similar problem with the VCV rack plugins, because there's somebody who's porting Airwindows plugins, and they asked me, like, do you want to do this? And I was like, yeah, but maybe you'll be doing different ones. I'm not going to do everything all at once, and I don't know how to do it yet. And they're like, okay, sure, and you can have my code. And so I downloaded their code, but I have not been able to get VCV Rack's plugin thing to run on my machine. Like, I believe I can run the program, I can run the plugins, I can learn how to do it, although it's not inspiring to me compared to working with analog, which I prefer to do. But the problem there is that I am supposed to use Xcode, which I do have, and compile the plugin development kit and such. And I run into these problems where it's like, did not compile, missing this library, this other thing isn't working, so sorry, bye. And I don't know what to do. So the point at which I get a working thing that functions and is a template that I can use is the point where I can start running like mad and spitting out cajillions of plugins of various kinds, and think, like, if I was to do VCV Rack, I'd be thinking up new things to do for it. But I'm stuck, because I'm at that place where it's like, I did the thing, I followed the instructions, it did not work, and I'm stuck. I have no idea where to go from here. It's one of those things. Boa has a weird question. What does purlin noise sound like? I don't know. I'm thinking it would depend upon how many octaves of it you used, and it would be like one-dimensional. Like, I would say, I think the Godot engine, and probably also Unity, there's game engines that give you purlin noise as a available thing. So you could probably make, like, print a file or pipe it to some kind of audio thing and fool with that in a game engine, because game engines are more likely to give you an immediate tap on purlin noise, just like a function that you can call or something. And Preston's asking, I've caught a focus for clippers and wondering if you have any clippers with adjustable saturation. If not, that's fine. Well, it depends. Like, if you mean literally a focus, focus has different distortion algorithms in it. And all the character plugins have a kind of adjustment that people ended up not liking on the, all the character plugins have what I like to call the new channel algorithm, where most of my older stuff uses a sine function for distorting. And I started doing a thing where some of the plugins could scale between that and just straight undistorted stuff. The idea was it would use the sine function to round off soft clipping, but then it could scale it up and down in size so that the rounded part could be smaller and smaller. And in doing that, there's a discontinuity that's introduced where the algorithm changes its behavior, and I found that people did not like that. If you mean clippers with adjustable gain into the saturation, that's easy. Stuff like density, drive, channel to an extent. And as if you're talking about literally hard clippers, That would depend upon how hard you hit it, and I strongly advocate clip only. Clip only is like AD Clip 4, except for it's simplified and has less possible, like AD Clip 4 has run into issues for some people. I forget exactly what was happening, but it's possible to drive it in such a way that it breaks. And clip only is a optimized form of the AD Clip algorithm, which also doesn't have like the fancy pants features that AD Clip 4 has, which I have decided was not, those things were not good. I just did them because I was reacting to Slate and Slate's FGX nonsense and all of this stuff about like, this is better than any form of clipper, everybody should get rid of all your clippers, only this is going to be good. And they never updated that, mind you, but that whole thing was basically introduce other audio that's like the remains of what was clipped off in the first place, and that's messed up audio-wise. Like, you can get sounds that sound louder than just raw clipping, but at a horrible cost. Bo, I would advise looking for Perlin audio, but I'm not sure if anybody's going to have it. And if you're talking about that, bear in mind that Perlin noise as just one octave is going to be kind of like a burbling noise. It's kind of like a, like there will be no edges to it. It'll be kind of like brown noise. It'll be like a high pass noise. And if you introduce more octaves, you're going to get more interesting waveforms. They're going to be somewhat predictable. You'll probably get a distinct kind of noise out of it. I'm just not sure how useful it would be, and it's not going to be a tonal center. Or maybe it will. You know, I think the answer to those questions is I do not know. I have no idea what would happen if you start doing Perlin noise. I just know what it looks like as a 2D or 3D form. What you're looking for is 1D Perlin noise. Dudecraft, how was my day? My day was okay. Could I recommend any devs who might do MIDI effects who... No, I don't know any devs. They don't really talk to... What I've found, and this is not always the case, maybe it's just me, is commercial devs doing audio, MIDI, all this kind of stuff don't always talk to each other or share their ideas. And that's why I went to open source, is because I'm not happy with the wanting to do these various things. And like if you're trying to look into stuff like how does the VST format work, that is a real mess because people sort of have to solve the problems themselves. Steinberg isn't great at communicating, and the people who find the solutions to their own problems are coming out of like the music business. So they're behaving very competitively, and they don't want to give some rival plugin developer their secrets, and so generally they don't. It's like the music business is also the business of Rudy Van Gelder and classic jazz records, in which the guy was incredibly, I could say stingy, with his ideas. There's a wide range of creators in this area who are making something amazing, but do not want anybody knowing how they did it. So that's the thing about it, is I don't know any other devs doing what I do. And there's lots of them out there. I just don't know them. It's like they're not talking to me. And when they do, they're doing, like, there's a fellow who, Ben Johnson actually, who has been able to build plugins. And so if they do talk to you, what they do is they like code something and then do a pull request and go, include this with your stuff. And they're just talking about how things work. I've never seen much of that. So that's what I try to supply. I'm trying to talk about how things work as much as I can. And it does extend outwards beyond just raw code. And I'll be doing some of that, like with that music Ketchup note that I made. If I can do it without my voice blowing out completely, because in these things, I'm usually good for not running out of words and having like radio silence, but it does get kind of scattered at times, and that's why having a notes to work from is sometimes useful. As far as Bo is concerned, 2D Perlin for stereo, well, it would depend. Like, if you got Perlin noise, let's get the sketchpad out there again. Say you've got Perlin noise. 2D Perlin noise would be on this surface, like, and it would be this wavering thing where you sample it at a given point and it gives you a number. 3D Perlin noise would be like that in a 3D surface, where you can go up as well as across or whatever. 1D is just a line. And if you were going to do 2D Perlin noise for stereo, the question becomes, do you sample this line and this line, or do you sample this line and this line, getting a very slight difference between the two, but never a big difference between the two, and a difference that's going to vary continually as you go. Like, sometimes it'll be the same, sometimes one will be larger or smaller. So if you're doing like stereo Perlin noise, you've got a built-in like width factor of how different you want them to be. You just have parallel lines that you're sampling from and space them farther apart if you want them to differ greater. And that's the same with all the octaves. Like, you're going to have parallel octaves, meaning a different sample of noise at a different frequency. Sebastian Fitness Page, what are some of your favorite albums? Obviously. I grew up on Yes's early 70s albums. I also grew up on 1970s Jethro Tull albums. And I've also got a bunch of other favorites of different kinds as well, but that's always a difficult question to answer. If anything, like, if you're a patron and can follow the Evergreen Records stuff, what you do is go to the Evergreen Records thing, and that list of records, which is a very large list, that's the collection of all the stuff that I basically like best. Because it's a record rack of limited size, and I just filled it with all the things that I loved, and left out stuff that, say, I also liked but didn't love as much as the stuff that went into the racks. So favorite albums is pretty much the Evergreens list, and it's a big list, and it's not exclusive like that I hate everything else, but that is a good reference list that one could have. Trying to find where this microphone is pointing. Okay, that's good. Yeah. So Seed's got a question of why does no current MIDI effects do something, and is there a technical issue preventing something like it? If MIDI effects isn't doing anything, I'm the last person to ask as far as how to make it work, because usually that's where I fall flat. Like, I work from existing structures, like stuff that's functioning, and come up with a novel thing to do within those structures. When the actual systems of the plugins or the computers or the compilers break down, that's when I get lost. And I don't have the background. Like, I did not go to school for computer science. I started computer science programming in BASIC on an Apple II when I was a kid. And so my entire approach to it is very non-tutored, and that's why I'll often say, like, well, I'm a really bad programmer, but I'm good at thinking about samples and audio, and I'm good thinking about DSP, and that's where that comes from. but there's a wide background that I think tends to lead people in certain directions. Like you get this wide background of programming, and it tells you like, here's how you do this, here's how you do this, here's how you do this. Oh, and here's the toolkit for manipulating frequencies and amplitudes and FFTs and filters and stuff. And you go, oh, okay, this is all I need to do. And that's where people fall flat, is because they know all the computer things, but they're not thinking creatively enough as far as manipulating samples in digital audio. Something as a substitute for my longer explanation. So, question I had was, why does no current MIDI FX do something? My longer explanation. And is there a technical issue preventing my longer explanation like it? Okay, you lost me even worse. Definitely come back with that one if you can rephrase it, because the challenge of doing MIDI FX is I have no idea where to begin. Oh, okay. So let's see. You're asking for a recommendation, answering a question. You don't know why no current MIDI FX does something. I do know some things about MIDI, and know it has a specific feature. You should specify the feature. Don't ask me like, why does this not have, so much as specify what the feature is you're talking about. I might know. I might know whether that's impossible or not, even though I don't know how to code MIDI FX. But you got to be able to specify the feature. Like, I have a fairly clear idea of how MIDI works and sends information, because I have to if I was going to do any of my work with like sysx events and stuff. I got to have a basic understanding of how that works, the bandwidth involved, and the whole structure. Like, one of the reasons I dislike MIDI rather than like loving modular is because modular is parallel processing and MIDI is serial. With modular, if I have a rise time on something to the speed of the transistors involved, I can have that rise time of a trigger firing off a bunch of different things, and they can fire exactly simultaneously. MIDI has to send individual notes, as long as it's a single MIDI stream, one at a time. Not only that, but it's interspersed with things like pitch bend events and stuff. So that is very restrictive, especially since MIDI is not the fastest protocol in the world. So outline your feature. Preston's quickly asking, what's your possibly next upcoming release? I can tell you that, but it's not a plugin. My next upcoming release is kind of around this new chart, which is like one of my chord charts. And you can see that it's circle of fifths all the way down, up and down and around and around. I haven't finished drawing this up, but this is my reference for the new chord organ firmware. And I just got some of that going where I've reprogrammed the chord organs that I use for my chords and things, and recoded it so that I could have a glide that was as slow as like 20 seconds rather than just half a second, which is a fairly simple update. I also speeded up so that the glide could be as fast as a millisecond rather than 5 milliseconds, because my take on that is, why wouldn't you give the fullest possible range of behavior? And so I did. And that is my update on that. I very well might go back in and add a additional number parameter for the stack function, because the stack function lets you get a slight chorusing effect. I was going to do like, okay, stack for normal chorusing effect, and then whack for crazy out of tune, like what the Hoover style sound. But then I realized, well, why don't I just add a number to the stack function, and then rather than going by a preset amount, use that number for the offset, which seems very possible to do. And then I can just sort of type in a number in the sort of programming of the synth, and it'll be doing that. I mean, the next factor after that would be reprogramming the trigger output, which fires when a chord changes, which is a thing, but I feel it's less useful than another control voltage input. And I can have that go to either glide speed or the putative whack function thing where it's a detune on the chorusing function. But before talking about that anymore, I'm going to chase after some of the more recent questions. And Seed has come up with the MIDI question. So, MIDI plugins receive an incoming stream of MIDI data, process it, spit it back out to whatever plugin. Imagine a single audio gate plugin that mutes audio once it reaches the threshold parameter. Yes, we can have audio gate plugins. Audio is not MIDI. I don't understand how that applies to MIDI. So continue explaining what you're trying to make happen. Are you trying to make a MIDI plugin that mutes notes that are too quiet velocity-wise? Okay, continuing. If the gate parameter knob value, so a knob value, basically you're talking about a MIDI panic button. That's what a MIDI panic button does. And a gate parameter, I'm not sure there's a specific gate parameter, just one of the MIDI continuous controllers. So you're looking for a plugin where if your continuous controller goes above the threshold, it goes and it does a MIDI panic. It goes and sends a note off to everything. And then refuses to accept any further note-ons. Okay, sounds like a more complicated thing. You need to describe it in terms of what the notes are supposed to do. So far, that sounds like something that could be done. I'm guessing nobody saw a reason to do it. That's probably what happened. Let me scroll up and make sure that I'm not missing things, because I'm trying to not miss things. Sounds an open sound control. I have no idea what that is. Projects, chord organ. Empty pictures is jam. Cool, thanks. How it works. Yep. How did I end up with that? I do a lot of listening. Like Mojo is a fairly simple algorithm. Mojo is also kind of the opposite of Dyno. The way I got to those is by making that algorithm in a way that could be manipulated. It could be dialed from the, I think, spiral to, it was supposed to go from spiral continuously to something else. That part didn't work. It wasn't doing anything useful, but when I got it to a particular point, I was like, hey, this is a good point, even though none of these other settings sound any good. And so I isolated that and started testing that out, and when it sounds like I have a specific algorithm that is a point upon this continuum that works really well. And oh look, this opposite point also on this continuum also works really well. So it was experimenting. It was experimenting and listening. It's always about the listening. Resources to get started with DSP. Honestly, I would almost recommend just starting to fool with stuff. Like learn how to work with buffers of samples and the concept of this is my chain of samples going along. I will process through this list of one sample after the other and manipulate it in various ways that I imagine. And I can remember, X many from the past or so on, and start combining things and varying things. Like learn how banks of samples work, learn how to implement a convolution reverb, which is the same as implementing a FIR filter, except for with a different Like a FIR filter is a sort of wave-like pattern, and a convolution reverb is a sort of random-like pattern, but in many ways they are the same. Like a FIR filter is the same as a convolution reverb, it's just using a different impulse response. So any other plugin I considered adding to the basic starter kit? That's the thing, is there's hundreds of them. Like, I specifically built the plugin Tape for the purpose of being like newbie friendly and just the go-to like analog softener kind of thing that also warms up and lifts the bass a little bit. And then when I first put it out, it was too bassy, and I had to introduce another control to give people more, control over that. But if I was to do a comparable basic starter kit that leaned a little harder in the way of like analogification and tapey sounds, I would be including tape rather than the more sophisticated versions with more stuff going on. And that's because I designed it for that purpose. It's more advanced in the sense of it does something that's more complicated, but it's designed to be approachable. And that, like, tape would be my call for another addition to a slightly less basic starter kit. Is it useful to use dither float for? Well, no, it's not useful to use dither float at all, basically. It's a demo. It demonstrates the concept, because the concept is audacious enough that nobody really gets. Well, obviously somebody did, because somebody's using the concept, and again, Isotope has access to their own code of it, but aren't necessarily using it. It is not useful to use dither float as the plugin. It's just not. The only possible use would be if you were working on a 64-bit bus and needed to output 32-bit floating point. And that's a pretty narrow case. So it's never useful to use dither float at all. And then use not just another dither at the end of the master before export, yeah. Interesting. Okay, so I'm beginning to understand. So MIDI panic as the button does not re-note on the notes that it note offed. Basically what you're looking for is like a mute button. That's complicated and could work. You could also consider that like if it was on an LFO, you would have a really harsh square wave MIDI tremolo. Because what you do is anything that was being played and being held, you could be regularly cutting it to silence and then reintroducing it as it started. And then the threshold thing, see, the difference between it being a gate and not is because your threshold control is not necessarily the amplitude of the output of your notes. Something that, see you later, Bill. Something that works as a noise gate, but then could come back. You're talking about something that is more like a tremolo, that is more like a sort of stutter effect, rather than a noise gate, and that might also be why talking about it. You're looking for basically a stutter effect, like being able to touch a button or throw another parameter from somewhere else, cut sustained MIDI things, and then have them pop back into existence. The trouble with that is that you're re-triggering the MIDI when you send it back again. So it's not really going to work like that. It's going to work like sequencing additional bursts of notes. At which point, I guess the question is, why aren't you just sequencing them? And I guess the answer would be because I want to hold these notes down and then have something else stutter them on and off. There's probably ways of doing this. I can see why you'd be wanting to do this as a MIDI effect. But the reason that nobody's done that is because they can't imagine wanting to do that. And that's a big problem with coding of musical stuff. The problem often that you get with programmers that have gone to school for doing that and they learned all about the programming is that their heads are full of programming and understanding how to work with that kind of stuff. But that doesn't give them the imagination to think of musical things to do that are worth doing. And it's a serious problem. It's a problem, I think, in many fields, not just music. I don't suppose you might consider, like, LFOing the output of the MIDI synthesizers? Because it sounds like what you're talking about, if you were doing the output, hey Anand, if you were doing the output, you wouldn't have to re-trigger the MIDI every time. Many MIDI-generated synthesizers have specific attack behaviors. So if you wanted to do a nice sharp tremolo, it seems like that could be done in audio rather than in strictly MIDI. The technical problems with doing that particular thing, what you would have to do is keep a buffer, because here's the problem. What happens when you're holding down some notes, you mute the things, you've kept track of the things that you're going to refire, and then you lift one of the notes while everything is being muted. You got to go through and eliminate what's in the buffer of stuff to refire when your gate goes back on. So you're needing to recalculate what's in the stored list of notes that are to be re-triggered. But basically that's what you're going to do, is keep a list of the notes that are on. And you're basically wanting to override the note ons and note offs. Like when you enable this gate, what you're really doing is sending an inverted note off and note on. You're going to send a note off, and then when the gate is lifted again, you're going to send the note on again that it initially had. And that will re-trigger. Also, you can't send all of them at the same time, so you're going to have a sequence of which ones to go. Yes, it does. Because you're sending note offs. So you got to remember which things you have sent a note, which things are currently being held in a note on that you've sent a note off for, so that you know to send a note on again. Well, hey man, if it's that easy, you should do it. Go and do it. Sounds like it would be neat. I was assuming that you'd have to keep a list. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you don't have to keep a list. The thing is, though, like, bear this in mind. How do you know a note is currently held? You're not getting a continuous signal. This is why you need a mini panic button. You're not getting you can't pull the keyboard and go, oh, by the way, which notes are being held? It doesn't know. So when you've sent note offs, that's it. You're done. There's no way of getting back that information. That's why you need to keep a list. So if you're sending a note off, you'd better make a list of that kind of stuff, because you will never know what notes have been held. It is a single moment of time when a key went down, and it's a note on thing, but there's no way of talking back to the keyboard and going, oh, by the way, which notes are being held right now, because it doesn't know. Yeah, this is why when you send a note off, you're going to have to make a list of the things that had note ons, and then you're also going to have to remove the thing from the list if that note came up. If you got MIDI coming through that has its own note off, that means that's no longer being held. And by the time the gate goes back up again, you're no longer going to be sending it. It's a list of MIDI note values, and the velocity is a separate thing. You're probably going to want to keep the velocity. You're going to want to make the entire MIDI note message. That is like X number of bytes. I forget exactly how many, but it can incorporate a whole bunch of different things. And yeah. So you're going to need to keep track of whatever is on, and that means every time a note comes in at all, whether the gate is open or not, you need to add that to your list. You're keeping a parallel list of what's going on, and that's what you're trying to switch on and off. And you're removing from that parallel list whenever a note up comes in, and your scanning of input MIDI data can't be restricted by your gate. You have to be continuing to listen regardless. Hey, Robert Kennedy says that LUT is working. What I've got here currently is, let's see, I wonder, yeah, that's not bad. I stuck a different filter on, actually. Here, check this out. If I can, just this, maybe not. Oh, it's stuck on too hard. I have a different lens filter on there, which is like a sort of gold diffusion thing, which I had from before. And then the specific LUT today is the GH5 Pigments LUT, which is, this is natural, and then if I crank it up, it starts taking all of the extra colorfulness out, and it gets a more film-like look. And if I held up like objects with colors in the middle, more accurately get the color. And what I'm doing is I'm doing 50% of that, because the full-on is a fairly aggressive color bleed, so I'm leaving it like that. So technically my fancy colors lookup table is actually a restricting some of the fancy colors lookup table combined with a actual lens filter. So yeah. And yeah, arpeggiators is exactly the same thing. They hold a list because they make a list. And so absolutely you could do that. There is no reason you couldn't do the thing you're looking for. I basically just told you how you do it. Is you're looking for a particular behavior, you've got a trigger, and what you're doing is you got to keep your list just like you were an arpeggiator, but instead of being an arpeggiator, your arpeggiation is all these notes off, all these notes back on, as long as they're still being held. And it's absolutely doable. The other thing about it is that you're going to have to make a cue for refiring the notes, because listening to a MIDI stream, you're only going to get one MIDI event at a time, because that's how MIDI works. And at a fairly slow rate, depending upon like how old school it is. Like you can say, here is your keyboard, I've just hit 6 notes at the same time, dong, but they're being sent over the MIDI protocol one at a time. So you're only ever going to see them in your MIDI plugin one at a time. And you're going to make your list. And then when you get the thing that is like mute these notes, fire these notes, what order are you going to mute them in? Are you going to mute them in the order that they made? Because you cannot send 6 note off signals at the same time. You cannot send 6 note on signals at the same time. You're going to have to pick. You're going to have to decide like in what sequence. I would suggest going low note to high note. That might be cool, because I have a feeling that stuff sounds better when the bassier things hit first, and higher frequency stuff, such as the faster attacks that might occur in higher frequency notes, hit after. So you might have like a strum-like effect, but it's happening very fast like any MIDI would. And It could be in the order of receiving, or you could reorder them in any kind of way. But when you are shutting everything off, or when you're turning everything back on again with your gate thing, you can have it seemingly be at the same instant, but it's never really going to be the same instant because it's MIDI. So, or first come, first serve. But it's never really going to be the same instant because it's MIDI. So you're going to have to send however many notes you've got in sequence. And that might be a whole separate thing. Just know that you cannot send all of those at once. You got to decide which come first. And it doesn't necessarily have to be first come, first served. You can recalculate them. And like if you've got 5 notes held down, and then the middle note is no longer being held down, you've taken one out of that list. Then you reorder the list, or put a new note coming in where the other one was missing, or what do? You manage that somehow. And that's sort of programmery type stuff. But it is no worse than an harp, you're right. Neat. So we went into a big MIDI rabbit hole. And it's 12:07. I still got probably a good solid half an hour. Anybody want me to talk about the music Ketchup thing I was going to talk about? It is indeed timed. Meanwhile, I'll drink all of my coffee. And we'll see where this goes. So yeah, I've answered the question of what am I doing next week, which is the chord organ thing is going to come out. I'll see how awesome I can make it by then. This Tuesday, when I do my little techno house music thing, I'm going full Colin Benders. I've been listening to Colin's live streams, and there's an entire community, the Streampunks community, that's doing that. And we're all very into the stuff that he's doing. And I couldn't help but notice that he had a lot of arpeggio stuff going all the time, because when you're building a system that's making music, it's not all about the oscillators. You also have control, you have sequencing, manipulation of various kinds. And he's got a thing where he'll have a higher note playing an arpeggio, like a real arpeggiator going on, but it's changing along with his chords. And it's maybe also changing according to how high or low the arpeggio goes. He's got that on knobs as well. And then he's got the velocity, not the in MIDI sense, but the note density. Like, are they 16th notes? Are they 32nd notes? Are they 64th notes? Are they dotted quarter notes? He's got that on a knob as well. So this guy, when he's got his like techno going on, a galloping noise, he'll grab a knob, typically kind of high up into the left, I think is where this particular knob lives. I don't think those are necessarily oscillators themselves, although they could be, but he'll be grabbing a knob, and what that knob is doing is that is the subdivision of the notes. So we'll have a thing going on, and it's the coolest thing ever. It's very fun. So that becomes part of your instrument, that you can reach this knob and go, I turn this, and stuff starts happening really frenetically, but it's still tied to the system. Well, I figured out how to do that. I'll be doing that on Tuesday. This is what I call fun, is I made one of the chord organs follow not just single notes, but then rather than having the notes follow the chords that I specified, like I've got this going so that the fifths increment the note like this, and everything gets retuned according to that. But the chord setting goes to these different chords, and I've specified minors and majors based on what fits within the key signature here. And so you can select these different chords, and it turns out to also be a cycle of fifths, but specifying the majors and minors and sevenths and things. And I don't actually have to specify seventh. Like if you go to the G, that is a mixolydian. So the seventh becomes very relevant to that mode. But you can just play a G chord as in the third and the fifth, and it's still a major third, and it still has a fifth, because only like the Locrian mode lacks a fifth. And so you can play a basic bog standard major chord and still have it work within that mode. But I have another set where rather than having it play like the chord or the bass note of the chord or the high note of the chord, which is the same as these, I just put them in order. So the chord sequence thing as an input no longer matters, but then you can patch a separate control, and I have two of these set up like this for now. I haven't heard them both. I set it up for the one, and then I've just duplicated it. Instead of having the chord voltage come in, you just use some kind of other random voltage or an arpeggio. If I had a clef diez, I'd be able to do the stepped thing that would make that work. I don't, but if I did, that's what would do it. And basically you program it with just the 7 notes in that scale. And there's 16 entries into the chord list. So I just use 16 notes. So it's like 7 plus a couple more. And in a increasing scale as it goes along. And if you arpeggiate on that or pump random values into it, you wind up getting this burbling, rippling melody of stuff. It could be random, or I've got a mimetic digitalis, which is like random, but it's a 16-note sequence or some other notes of sequence. And doing that means that you're playing these melodies, but these melodies will always be notes that are contained within that chord structure that you're currently at. It's not necessarily going to follow what the root is. It doesn't even know what the root is, but it's going to stay within the key. And as your chord changes, the key changes. So it's doing the same thing Colin does. And it's that I have going on. So that was great fun. Aiden was using Purist Fader. Cool, I'm glad that it was working. So before I get off onto that, because I can say that I've done it, and that's the thing that's coming up for this coming week. I'm going to see how far I can take the upgrade in the firmware before I do it, because I do know that not that many people are using that. And in a sense, it's like that doesn't matter because this is what interests me. But, and also the Tom Whitwell apparently knows who I am and likes the fact that I'm doing open source stuff. So that's pretty cool. I just need to do a better job of doing this firmware and also making videos to explain how it's done. And so I've made like extension cables for my headphones so that I can do a video that's literally over here working on the synthesizer while still using this microphone and not feeding back and not having to use the speakers and just a pile of stuff like that. It's a bunch of extra work that I had to do in order to make that happen. But now that I've done it, I should be able to go. And you will see more about that as it comes out. So here, let me take the last half hour or so, unless other people have questions, in which case you can interrupt me with questions, and talk about this concept of music ketchup. The reason I say ketchup is because ketchup is an unusual foodstuff. It is a sauce that initially was designed to have a tomato sauce that wouldn't go bad. It's a tomato sauce with vinegar, which preserves the tomatoes so they don't go off. And tomatoes have a sweetness, and the vinegar has bitterness, and you add salt to ketchup. And the thing about the weird thing about ketchup is that when Heinz came up with a formulation of ketchup, they basically dominated everything so much that there have been no replacement ketchups ever. Like you can have whole different styles of mustard, like French's yellow mustard and golden brown mustard and Grey Poupon and all manner of different kinds of stuff like that. There is no overwhelmingly correct mustard unless you're talking like hot dogs or something, in which case, or certain recipes might have a particular kind. Ketchup is different. There is no other ketchup. You go to the ketchup aisle and it's like all frickin' Heinz. And anybody else is basically a sideshow. Nobody has really done a alternate replacement ketchup. And when people try, they usually fail pretty hardcore. And the reason is because that particular formulation has balanced, and it's not even in a healthy way. It's like, okay, the reason that particular ketchup wins so hard is because it has a bunch of salt in it. Salt isn't necessarily great for you. It's been jacked with a bunch of sugar, like corn syrup and stuff. That's not necessarily, you don't taste it, but that's not necessarily good for you either. And the upshot of it is that ketchup, as we know it, has sweetness, sourness, saltiness, bitterness, and umami, which is a Japanese word for a kind of fullness of sound. And you can get that through monosodium glutamate. I'm not sure whether that's added to ketchup as well. Could be, for all I know, but tomato solids do bring some of that as well. And the blending of these flavors is so well balanced that you cannot identify a single thing to counter, like you don't get salty out of ketchup, even though it is very strongly there, because you're distracted by bitter, but you don't get bitter out of it because you're distracted by the sweetness, and you don't get sweet out of it because you're distracted by the sourness. It's like, I don't know, sweet and sour sauce or whatever to the nth degree. Every single aspect of it is distracting from every other kind of aspect of it. And the result is like, wow, whatever it is that I wanted, this has lots of it. Doesn't matter whether I'm craving salty or I want sweetness or whatever. It's like, boy, this has everything. And you can't associate. It's the same with like beverages like Coca-Cola. Like cola flavor is a bunch of weird things. It's like, I don't know, licorice and raisins and God knows what, wintergreen. There's just a bunch of things in a cola flavor. But the reason that it dominates is because it is so balanced and complicated that it's identified as its own thing and can't be recognized as any of the raw sources anymore. And when you have like off-brand cola, you'll have like, a strong wintergreen note or something, or just something will pop out and it'll be distracting. And the most successful cola flavors like Coke and Pepsi are so well balanced with their magic secret formulas and stuff that you don't get a sense of any particular flavor popping out. Instead, it's like, oh, this is a completely unique flavor that is harmonious and very complicated, and I can't get enough of it. And it's not just making me think pruny or something. Same with ketchup. So the thing about this is, what if you applied that to music? And so I've got these little notes here, and I did a little free associating on the subject. Like, for instance, if you're looking for sweet sounds, you might be doing strings, voice harmonies, high percussion in the sense of like shakers and hi-hats and stuff. Especially stuff like a hi-hat hit with the side of the stick rather than on the tip, so it's not this spike, but it's like pss, 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 pss. You could have sentimental lyrics, that can be sweet. Rhythmic swing, stuff like, just sweet things. You contrast that with, say, sour. I tend to think of like acid techno as having the sourness. Often that is like, people will consider the 303 filter to be specifically a sour filter. A distorted 303, you could also say some heavy guitar grinds are sour, feedback bursts, vocal fry, vocal compression. You could say aggressive metronomic stuff can be sour. It's a more abstract kind of thing, but the point is identifying stuff that's not sweet. Salty? You could go for, say, tonal rawness, sonority and mid-range, vocal projection, which is not the same thing as vocal compression. Second line, counter rhythms, it's a little spice rather than the generic, ordinary, regular stuff. Under bitter, which I also put like quinine, there is a kind of resonant filter high on S3M tracker things that has been, like the band Infected Mushroom did a lot of early stuff basically on trackers. And there is a code, I have never mastered like doing this as a plugin. I'd like to, at some point I will. But on the old Scream tracker, if you cranked up the resonance to really freak out and acidify the sounds, there's a bug in the filter. The filter is not exactly as it should be, and that gives a very distinct, weird, bitter, synthetic, unrealistic quality to the notes that you filtered using this S3M filter. And I call that a legitimate bitter flavoring to add to things. It can be like positively addictive, although you don't necessarily want to rely on only those kinds of flavors. But you throw something like that in, you go like, okay, so sour could be like a crunchy analog 303 filter. Well, bitter could be this synthetic, you know, acid trance techno tracker style filter that's not correctly coded, that there's a bug. And or like say bit crushing, maybe bitter, hey, what do you want? You can throw in some of that digital garbage, and that can throw in like a bitterness quality that balances against other things. You know, a string which is fret buzzing, a voice that is out of tune, rhythmic dislocations. These can be elements of bitterness as opposed to the smoothness of everything being harmonious and in time and working. So you throw a little bitterness in to make things interesting. And then umami, which is fullness, I would say that'd be like, you know, your tube tape thickness, the mudslide of a precision bass, S3Ms that are more muting and rolling stuff off, emotive lyrics, sincerity, a deep pulse. I'm loving dub techno style deep pulses. And if you manage to combine enough of these elements, you start running into music and audio and stuff that is positively addictive, that is distinctly its own thing and doesn't feel, it feels like it lives in its own world. And hence my note of music ketchup and what one should do with that kind of thing is balancing these various things. And I've tried to do this with, say, you know, my techno music stuff, and then also introducing a electric guitar, or you know, I throw various things in. I like to distort this or that, then I like to have other stuff be undistorted. I have very specific ideas about how these things are to combine, but it's never about how do I make everything as sweet as possible, or how do I make everything as salty as possible. And when I fail or I flounder, it's because I have basically forgotten some aspect of that, where like one of the risks that I might run into is I have just figured out how to make the arpeggio things happen. So what have I done? I've set it up so that now there's 2 channels of that, and maybe I'll turn them both on, and then the entire jam for Tuesday is going to be these twittering synthesizers. And that's not music ketchup. That is overwhelmingly bitter or overwhelmingly sour. Or maybe if they're all very harmonious, overwhelmingly sweet. But, you know, where's the sour notes? You know, if everything is distorted, then it's too recognizable as distorted. It's like I gotta include stuff that is not in the genre. And this is one of the things that I get lost in when I start doing your rock and roll-y type stuff. As much as I'm an enormous progressive rock fan and grew up on that kind of stuff, learned to play guitar fairly well, even though I generally don't. Like, I'm capable of playing guitar fairly well, but often I will just choose to play really sour notes all the time. And again, that's a fault, that's a problem. because it's not encompassing the full range of things. This is something that basically I need to try to remember for myself, that I'm trying to focus harder on, and I would definitely endorse people doing this kind of stuff as well. Think of it in terms of music Ketchup. Think of it in terms of, if you've got a lot of this, what can you have that is the opposite, or that is a completely different kind of thing, and be balancing stuff out. Zappa counseled doing stuff like that. Zappa counseled having stuff be like some sort of color sculpture. A lot of big, heavy, dense stuff is balanced by a lighter thing over here. And it worked for him. It's a very effective way of dealing with things. I'm not sure what the musical equivalent of deep frying is, but hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate that on Tuesday. We'll see. And why distortion plugs throwback harmonics when they reach Nyquist? Yep. I can draw that as a picture, and I will, because in the last, let's see, 41, last 10 minutes or so, I may as well. So here's a frequency range, right? And here's our Nyquist limit. What that means is kind of like on this drawing here, you're sampling things at discrete moments. Like, all you can do is listen to the continuous thing going along this line and sample it at these discrete moments. That's the only thing that you can even do to make the thing work. And if you're doing that, you can go, whoop, sample those discrete moments, and then connect the dots. Now, connecting the dots is not done in this linear way, but all the same, it is done. Now, what happens when we have this? It's a little bit too fast. What we get is up, 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 down, 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 sort of medium, up. If we connect these dots, that's a different frequency. It's skipping over the ones that are going too fast to keep track of. And because it's a little bit out of sync, it's like if you were watching a bicycle wheel go and it's on a video camera or a film camera, and it's like, oh, and then the wheel's turning backwards. Wait, the wheel's not turning backwards. Why does it look like it's turning backwards? It's aliasing. The sample being done is a little bit too slow to follow this frequency. And so what happens is you're catching it only at the top of the sample, and then because it's a little faster, it's going sort of cycling in and out, much like a bicycle or a car wheel being filmed on video or film might look like it's turning backwards. And that is how the sample winds up catching stuff that turns into a much lower frequency. And that is how you get these funny harmonics. They're not really harmonics at all. They're like fake noises that have nothing to do with the audio. The only way to fix that is to completely and totally stop the high frequency before it gets to the sampling point. Just basically make it already start as like, no. If it doesn't have a frequency, it can't return this weird wrong frequency, because there is no way to make this faster frequency get sampled properly. And so that's the guts of how sampling and aliasing works, is like the plugin should be able to stop working around Nyquist, but it absolutely doesn't and never will, because that's how sampling works. You can only sample within the range of half of the sampling frequency on down. Anything beyond that is just going to get messed up. There is no way to make the plugin detect. The only way to do it is to suppress all the higher frequencies before you get to the point of sampling. And that is what a lot of your fancy oversampling type stuff is about. It's trying to both go to a higher frequency that can understand this stuff and then use that power to flatten out what is being done before you resample it back to the regular rate again. That's all that work. That's all that ever is making sure that you're not trying to capture waveforms that are too fast for the sampling rate to deal with. Adon's asking, have I used Waves Vitamin? Nope, I have not. Sometimes not always beats my tape emulations. Well, okay, rock on for it. I have not used it. Generally, if I'm doing, like, I am not in a position right now to be literally using analog tape for stuff. But if I was going to go deep into something like that, I would be wanting to use actual analog tape for stuff. And the thing about it is that I'd be wanting to keep the analog tape in such good condition and be using something like 1/4 inch and be running like, I don't know whether it would be 15 or 30 EPs, because I am a fan of bass, but you can get some good high frequency response out of that stuff as well. And I'd be wanting to keep it so clean and well maintained that I might as well be using digital. That's the thing, is that well maintained, properly working tape isn't a big pile of mush. It can be very clear and accurate. And digital starts out as very clear and accurate to a fault, where there is no give to any of it, so you have to do all of your coloration or whatever as pre-processing. Hey, Kurt, thank you. The thing about the oversampling is that if I'm operating at a sampling rate, I can't make other things in the same DAW be a different sampling rate. Some things can operate like that. I wonder whether plugins like Patchwork, I think Patchwork is just about the matrix of things, but there are things that can upsample, but that runs into problems as well. Like, there are things like impulse responses where you're going to need to keep track of previous buffers of sounds. It ain't necessarily that simple. And I would never want to do a plugin that can just oversample, because if you can do that, why aren't you just running at a higher sample rate? I'm starting more and more to work with plugins where I'm assuming that people are going to be running at like 96K or even 192, although apparently some of the stuff that I've done starts to trip and fall over and have problems running at 192, which is unfortunate. Nothing that I've included in Starter Kit, but some of the older plugins, and certainly things like old versions of Bus Colors or the character plugins won't run normally at 192 because they're tied to a sampling rate. But I would never prefer to do a special plugin to like upsample and downsample. I would always want to just run the session, because if you're upsampling and downsampling, all you're doing is a bad quality sample rate conversion constantly and all over the thing. You might as well just run the whole session at a higher rate. And then you don't have the bad quality sample rate conversions constantly in your mix. Better to just, if you want to be clear of aliasing, then run at 96K and don't go for excruciatingly bright sounds, and you'll be fine. Even if you're running at like 44.1K, if you're not going for excruciatingly bright sounds, you're probably good. 44.1K will actually get you pretty freaking excruciatingly bright. It's just that there's no headroom among the brightness. You got to really restrict it very tightly. And if you're running at 96K, you got a lot more range. You don't need to worry nearly as much about restricting the top end of the brightness. Things are normally going to sort of do that for you. Computer musician, I should rename the Q&A. I don't know about that. My problem is that I don't often have the subjects. And if I was to name this one Music Ketchup, which I could do, then that's only what I touched on in the very end of the chat. So that's not a really very... I could tack on that as like, yeah, that is a good suggestion, computer musician. So sure, maybe I'll do that. I will rename the Q&A, and it'll be Q&A live stream : Music Ketchup, and I'll try to keep doing that, seeing as I'm already doing that for the music jams. I'm not necessarily going to come up with a special cover image for this. There's not all that much to it other than just me talking. But yeah, okay. I'll do that, and I'll start off with this one, and we'll call it Q&A live stream Music Ketchup. Just cause, even though I touched on that very briefly. Because you're right, that is a good idea. And it also means scanning back into it, there is some chance of finding stuff in old live streams if it has that little reference. You scan through it a little bit. And Seed, you are absolutely right that the missing energy, depending upon what you're working on, those high overtones don't necessarily have volume enough to matter that much. Like, oh, Anand, you missed me writing the question on the screen. Yeah, technically I could be doing that, but it was a lot of work. And if I have a really good reason to do something like that, I'll start doing it again. Today was not the day where I had anything that specific going on. That's a good point. Maybe I like using the analog stuff. Maybe I should get myself a whiteboard, a chalkboard or something like that, and I'll have it in shot, and that would probably be a good solution. I'll come up with something. It seems as if I should be able to come up with something. I think the dry erase board sounds like that might be the best answer there. And it could also serve the purpose of this kind of stuff. It'd be like Chris with his giant blackboard, and I'll get a lot of chalk. And that seems like that'd be kind of cool. So yeah, the thing about aliasing is that once you start manipulating stuff, you run into problems. If you, dude, sometimes I have no idea what I'm talking about for half an hour, never mind 5 minutes. Dusan Spasic, funny you should mention that. I do have old amp plugins, and I promised to get back into working on those, and that's going to be coming as well as the plugin Elation, which is basically ready to come out. And they are coming even though I don't think they're very good as amp plugins, but they are going to be coming out as VST regardless. Seed, what Dusan means is I have old plugins called things like Big Amp and Fire Amp and like Tiny Amp and whatever that I made back in like 2007. I'm not into them, and I don't like using guitar plugins. I like using guitar amps and a pedal board, and I'm so committed to that I'm just to me, the guitar thing goes all the way through analog to the point where it's coming out of a speaker. And then you mic the speaker, very possibly with a 57 of some kind. And that goes to digital, and then you don't touch it. But, But what Dusan means is those don't exist as VST yet. Those exist only as Apple audio units from 2007. They need to be brought up to speed. They need to be brought up to date. I have not yet done that, but I'm working on it. And with that, it is 12:42, so it's probably time for me to shut down for a little, and go lie splat on my back for a while before going and doing further things. Again, I've got a pile more chord organ work to do because that's coming out next week, and I'd like to take it as far as I can before I reintroduce it and do the good video for it this time. But yeah, the amp things, those are coming along as well, because that's fairly, it's pretty plausible that I can get those working. They weren't super complicated, and I might not think they're worthy of being called guitar amps, but they exist, and there's no reason you shouldn't be able to have them. Yeah, computer musician, the thing about that is aliasing is not just an esser. That is throughout the entire frequency range. And you can use bit crushing for that. I've got multiple bit crusher type things that you can use. So in doing that, you're going to make stuff sort of coarser and blockier and more opaque sounding. And it absolutely is something you can do, but it isn't a re-esser because it doesn't stick to just high frequencies. Alrighty, and on that note, I'm going to say goodbye to chat for now. And I'll talk to you guys later. Catch up with me on the Tuesday Jam. I'll see how crazy I can get the chord organs running by then. And I'll see whether I can remember my music Ketchup thing and not have the entire thing be twittering ARPs just because I can. And we'll see where that goes. So I'll see you later, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.